Our diplomatic efforts are continuing to avoid war between Russia and Ukraine as Russian troops step up what they're calling military exercises in the area, and world leaders become increasingly alarmed about the prospect of all-out conflict. Last night, US President Joe Biden called on any Americans in Ukraine to get out of the country, saying he would not send troops to rescue them if the Russians invade. The UK has a number of troops in Ukraine in a training capacity and has been sending mostly non-lethal weapons to support the Ukrainians. Other countries have sent more serious kit, including Lithuania, which, with the blessing of the Americans, has sent anti-aircraft missiles called Stingers. America itself has sent anti-tank missiles. Although Ukraine is not a member of NATO, some NATO allies have been sending troops to the borders in a show of strength and solidarity, designed to make President Putin think twice. Last night, I spoke to a senior source in Ukraine's armed forces who told me that they do not expect an invasion within the next few days. They believe the Russian president has been taken aback by the strength of reaction from NATO allies and is not ready to move. However, nobody expects President Putin to just leave empty-handed. On the contrary, some believe he may still be planning an assault even on the capital, Kyiv. Well, joining me now to discuss the latest situation is foreign policy expert Nile Gardiner of America's Heritage Foundation. Nile is also a former advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Joining me from Washington, I believe. Thank you very much for joining us, Nile. Now, I was listening to an interview you gave a couple of weeks ago now, in which you talked about the real prospect of an assault by Russian forces on the capital. Where would you assess the likelihood of that now?
Well, thanks very much for having me on the show today, Isabel. And I have to say that we are in crisis mode. And certainly the view here in Washington increasingly is that we are going to face a Russian invasion. And you would have seen, of course, the announcement by the State Department in the United States last night calling on US citizens to evacuate the country immediately. And so the stakes are incredibly high. And the Russians have just, of course, carried out a military exercise in Belarus involving 30,000 troops, perhaps the biggest military exercise since the end of the Cold War. And so certainly I think it's the view of the Biden administration that we are heading for war in Ukraine. And in terms of the scale of the Russian buildup, there are over 130,000 troops already mobilized on multiple fronts. That figure could well rise to about 175,000 troops. And certainly strategists here in Washington expect any Russian invasion to be a very large-scale one that could also reach the capital city of Kyiv. And Kyiv is only 140 miles away from Belarus, where there are 30,000 Russian troops. And so, without a doubt here, I mean, the Russians are not bluffing. They're not playing games. Putin, in my view, is a monstrously evil dictator. He doesn't care about the potential loss of human life in Ukraine. We could see tens of thousands of people killed here during a Russian invasion. And the Ukrainians, I believe, will fight. They will fight for their freedom, for their sovereignty. And they are prepared, many of them, to die facing the Russian forces. So we could well see, the biggest war in Europe for many, many decades, potentially since the end of World War II here. So certainly in the United States, the US administration is preparing for a full conflict scenario.
And the Russians currently control, I think, around 5% of Ukraine, don't they, with the Crimea and areas of the Donbass region. How much do you think President Putin will settle for? I mean, of course, he would like all of it, but what might be a compromise?
Well, that's a very good question, and certainly I think that Putin will be aiming to take a large chunk of the country occupied, especially in the east. I think one of Putin's goals will be to occupy a sufficiently large part of the country and then enter into sort of peace talks with the West. And of course, the French and the Germans no doubt will be queuing up to do some kind of deal with the Russians. And we saw Emmanuel Macron, of course, heading over to Moscow just a few days ago, basically groveling before Putin. And much of Europe, unfortunately, is in full appeasement mode. And there's a big contrast between the position of the British government and that of most Western European governments. And it's actually Brexit Britain that is standing up to the Russian bear at this time. But you can be sure that strategists in Paris and Berlin and Brussels are thinking about all sorts of compromises with the Russians, even in the event of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And they'll be thinking about some kind of peace deal that could be signed. And I think that Putin's ultimate objective will be to gain a lot of new territory in Ukraine, hold on to it, and then ensure that the Russians have full control over that territory for many decades to come. So that will be the strategy here.
And very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, do you think that President Biden has struck the right tone here? He's gone slightly veered from one end to the other, initially saying that a sort of minor incursion might be okay, and then getting quite kind of robust on it. How do you think that's played out in terms of the Kremlin response?
Well, I think Biden is tougher now than he was before. But some of it's too little, too late. I think that Biden's initial approach was very, very weak. His refusal, for example, to sanction the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was a huge mistake. And Biden is now toughening up his act somewhat. But I do think the Russians believe that Biden is a very weak leader, and there's a reason why the Russians are moving now, because they think there's a real lack of U.S. leadership on the international stage. And in the wake of the disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal, the Russians are emboldened, the Chinese are emboldened. The enemies of the free world think the US superpower is in decline. And I do think Joe Biden's overall leadership on foreign policy has been absolutely disastrous. And this kind of weakness certainly sends a message to the Russians that the United States is not going to stand up to them. So it's been very disappointing overall, I think, the US approach. But we are seeing some stronger signals being sent now.
Very briefly, what's the best case scenario here? How might this, if we're optimistic, end?
Well, the best case scenario, of course, is if the Russians pull back. But, we cannot make any concessions to the Russians here. You can't really negotiate with a figure like Vladimir Putin. I mean, he is a brute and a tyrant and a bully. And the same goes to Sergei Lavrov, his foreign secretary, who we saw in action yesterday talking to Liz Truss. And so, you can't trust the Russians, frankly. But the best case scenario is the Russians pull back from an invasion and that we don't make any concessions to Moscow. But the way things are looking, the Russians are moving towards not just an invasion of Ukraine, but a full-scale invasion, a very large invasion here. And it would be, an act of monstrous evil by the Russian regime. Putin is behaving in an extremely barbaric manner. He is the aggressor here, threatening a free sovereign nation. We must do all we can to support the people of Ukraine at this time.
Thank you, Nile Gardiner from the Heritage Foundation in Washington on the latest in Ukraine.